The tertiary negotiation platform orbited a star that nobody particularly cared about, which made it perfect neutral ground for species who cared very much about appearing to care about fairness. The station itself was a monument to bureaucratic excess. 300 kilometers of interconnected modules, each one designed to accommodate a different atmospheric composition, gravitational preference, or architectural ego. Somewhere in the planning committee's fever dream, they decided that making everyone equally uncomfortable would promote cooperation. The result was a structure that looked like someone had thrown a construction manual into a particle accelerator and hit the chaos setting. Inside Conference Module 77 Alpha, the atmosphere was set to universal compromise, which meant it was too humid for species that breathed methane, too dry for aquatic species, and exactly wrong for everyone else. The gravity was set at 0.85 standard, a number derived from averaging the preferences of 47 civilizations and satisfying precisely none of them. The chamber itself was circular, because angular rooms apparently promoted aggressive posturing, according to some study that the Nythean delegation had commissioned and everyone else suspected was complete nonsense. The human delegate had arrived 12 minutes ago, and the entertainment value was already exceeding expectations. He stood at the designated human position, which someone with a sense of humor had placed between the Vrelliks contingent and the Holveks collective. His name was something short and blunt, the kind of designation humans seemed to favor because their vocal anatomy couldn't properly handle civilized polysyllabic naming conventions. He wore the standard diplomatic uniform of his species, a dark fabric suit that covered everything except his face and hands, as if his people were embarrassed by their own biology. To be fair, they probably should be. The Vrelliks found him fascinating in the way one might find a particularly slow-moving fungus fascinating. They were insectoid, though calling them insects was like calling a supernova a light source. Each stood roughly 2 meters tall on 4 legs, with another 4 limbs adapted for manipulation. Their exoskeletons were the color of tarnished copper, and when they moved, they produced a clicking sound that their translators rendered as contemplative humming. Their lead negotiator, a specimen whose carapace bore the mathematical proofs of 7 doctoral dissertations etched in traditional acid script, kept tilting his head at angles that suggested he was trying to figure out which end of the human was the top. The Nytheans were less overtly curious and more overtly crystalline. They'd evolved on a high-gravity world with silicon-based biochemistry, which meant they looked like someone had taught gemstones how to be pretentious. Their bodies refracted light in ways that violated several minor physics laws, and they communicated through harmonic resonance that made normal species' ears hurt. They'd positioned themselves on the raised platform side of the chamber because of course they had. Their primary speaker, a rose quartz-colored entity whose facets had been cut in the latest philosophical pattern, kept emitting frequencies that the translators interpreted as dismissive amusement. The Holveks collective had sent 3 representatives because they did everything in 3. They were amphibious, bipedal, and covered in skin that shifted through colors based on their emotional state. Currently, all 3 were displaying shades of orange and yellow that indicated they found something moderately entertaining. They'd been the first to arrive, had taken the best positions near the temperature regulators, and had spent the last hour making observations about other species' delegations that their translators accidentally broadcast at full volume. The subject of today's negotiation was colony designation Epsilon Rac 47, a barely habitable rock orbiting a barely stable star in a barely interesting sector of space. The only thing that made it worth arguing about was a deposit of rare earth minerals that happened to be rare even on Earth, which was saying something. Humans had surveyed it first, filed the proper claims, and started preliminary extraction. This should have been the end of the story, but the galaxy had approximately 17 million regulations about resource rights, and apparently 3 other species had decided that surveyed it first was more of a suggestion than a rule. The human delegate had been explaining the concept of prior claim for 6 minutes now, and you could watch the comprehension failing to happen in real time. The documentation is quite clear, he said, his voice carrying that particular frequency humans used when they were being determinedly patient. Human exploratory vessel August Pioneer logged the discovery 8 standard months before any other species entered the system. The mineral rights were filed according to Galactic Concordance Treaty 7-419. Subsection, Documentation. The Vrelliks negotiator interrupted, and his clicking laugh sounded like rocks in a tumbler. How amusingly primitive. You wave your papers as if physical records mean anything to species who store information in quantum matrices. We also have it in quantum matrices, the human replied, still maintaining that impressive patience. And 3 other backup formats. Would you like me to transmit what the Vrellik ascendancy finds curious? The negotiator continued, because listening was apparently optional, is the presumption that your species possesses the capacity to properly exploit such resources. You are physical. He paused, consulting his translator. What is the term? Ah yes, soft. The Nythean representative chimed in, literally with a frequency that translated as gentle mockery. Soft bodies, no natural armor plating, no redundant organ systems, a single brain in a fragile cranial structure. Your species is delicate. Like decorative vegetation. One of the Holveks trio flickered through a shade of green that indicated Schadenfreude, a concept as they'd apparently mastered before achieving spaceflight. We have studied your biology. You require constant climate regulation. Your flesh tears with minimal pressure. You consume other organic matter by grinding it with calcium deposits in your mouths. It's all very, the translator struggled, endearing. The human delegate's expression didn't change, which was itself impressive. Humans were known for their facial mobility, the way their features broadcast emotions that more sensible species kept encrypted. But this one had clearly trained himself into diplomatic neutrality, even as 3 separate species took turns explaining why his people were basically the galaxy's participation trophy civilization. Our physical characteristics, he said, still in that measured tone, are not relevant to the legal standing of our territorial claim. Everything is relevant. The Vrellik negotiator clicked forward, his legs producing sounds like a percussion section. You ask us to respect boundaries claimed by a species that cannot enforce them. Your people arrived in that system with vessels barely capable of sustained void travel. Your extraction equipment is inefficient. Your personnel require extensive environmental support. You are asking predator species to respect the boundaries of prey. That word hung in the recycled air for a moment. Prey. The human's jaw muscles tightened microscopically. The Concordance Treaty doesn't have a strength requirement for territorial claim. Perhaps it should, the Nythean sang, her facets refracting light in what might have been a shrug. The galaxy is no place for soft species with soft claims. Perhaps you should return to your little water world and leave resource extraction to species properly equipped for it. The Holveks trio had shifted to a unified shade of blue that indicated they were thoroughly enjoying the show. One of them moved closer, invading the human's personal space with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered consequences. In their multivocal harmony they said, "We have a saying in the collective, the weak are food for the strong. It's not personal, it's simply cosmic efficiency." The human delegate took a breath, and those who knew his species might have recognized the deliberate slowness of it, the way he seemed to be counting something in his head. But none of the species in this chamber knew humans. They knew the data: carbon-based, oxygen breathers, moderate gravity requirements, unremarkable sensory capabilities, skin that could be punctured by their own planet's vegetation. They'd read the reports from human diplomats who were selected specifically for their non-threatening demeanor, their ability to smile and nod while being condescended to by species who'd achieved faster-than-light travel while humans were still figuring out agriculture. What they didn't know, what their databases couldn't tell them, was what humans were before they became diplomatic. The Vrellik negotiator moved closer still, and his bulk cast a shadow over the human's position. At full height he had nearly a meter of reach advantage, and his exoskeleton could probably survive small arms fire. His clicking took on a rhythm that his translator rendered as aggressive posture. "Here is what will happen," he said, and his mandibles clicked in a pattern that indicated final declarations. "Your species will withdraw its claim. You will provide us with all survey data and preliminary extraction coordinates. In exchange, we will not pursue reparations for your wasting of our time. This is generous. This is more than soft species deserve." The human looked up at him, still maintaining that diplomatic mask, still breathing in that controlled pattern. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. "No." The single syllable seemed to confuse them more than an hour of legal arguments had. The Nythean resonated a frequency of surprise. The Holveks trio flickered through colors that indicated recalibration of expectation. The Vrellik negotiator's head tilted at an angle that suggested his translator had malfunctioned. "No," he repeated, as if testing the word for structural integrity. "No," the human said again. "We're not withdrawing the claim. We're not providing data to species who don't have rights to it. And if you pursue this course of action, we'll see you in the Concord's court, where your intimidation tactics won't play quite as well." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop, though the environmental controls hadn't changed. The Vrellik negotiator leaned down, bringing his head level with the humans, close enough that his mandibles could have reached out and done significant damage. His clicking took on overtones that needed no translation. "Soft species," he said, and his tone had moved past condescension into something darker, "should learn when they are outmatched." The human stood perfectly still, but something had changed in his stance. Some microscopic shift in the way he held his weight. His hands, which had been clasped professionally behind his back, had moved to his sides. His breathing pattern had altered in a way that the room's sensors noted but didn't flag as significant. In retrospect, the sensors should have been better programmed. "Is that a threat?" the human asked, and his voice had gone very, very quiet. "It is," the Vrellik negotiator clicked, moving even closer. A statement of cosmic reality. The human's eyes, which had been carefully neutral, focused with an intensity that made even the Nytheans' crystalline structure seem to refract light differently. When he spoke, his words were measured, but underneath them was something the translators struggled to categorize. "Then let me make a statement of my own reality," he said. "Step back." The Vrellik negotiator clicked what his translator rendered as laughter, and reached out one of his manipulation limbs toward the human's shoulder. A gesture that in Vrellik culture indicated ownership, dominance, the right to physically displace inferior beings. His limb never made contact. What happened next would be debated in xenobiology departments for the next decade, analyzed in military academies across 40 systems, and completely rewrite the galaxy's understanding of what the word soft actually meant. To understand what went catastrophically wrong in Conference Module 7.7, one needs to understand a fundamental truth about galactic civilization that nobody had bothered to mention in the welcome brochures. The galaxy was not, as human science fiction had optimistically suggested, full of warrior races and apex predators engaged in glorious combat. The galaxy was actually full of species who had survived specifically by being very, very good at running away from things that wanted to eat them. The Vrelliks, for all their impressive exoskeletons and multiple limbs, had evolved from herd insects on a world where the primary survival strategy was cluster together and hope the actual predators eat someone else first. Their hard shells weren't offensive weapons. They were the biological equivalent of locking your doors and hoping the home invaders got bored. Their ancestors had survived by being numerous, not dominant. The Nytheans' crystalline perfection was even more telling. They'd evolved on a high-gravity world where being rigid and immobile was the best defense against getting noticed by the things that ate mobile prey. Their entire civilization was built on the concept of, if we don't move, maybe it won't see us, elevated to an art form involving quantum physics and philosophical smugness. The Holveks collective's color-changing skin, that fascinating biological display, pure camouflage evolution. Their ancestors had survived by blending into coral reefs while larger, hungrier things swam past. Their entire psychological framework was built around the concept of hide first, think late. Every major spacefaring civilization in the galaxy had one thing in common. They were the descendants of prey animals who'd gotten smart enough to build weapons, fast enough to build ships, and paranoid enough to build both in large quantities. The entire galactic order was essentially a support group for species who'd survived by being skittish, defensive, and really good at playing the victim loudly enough that someone else became the target. This meant that their understanding of aggression was fundamentally academic. They knew about predators the way someone who'd read about fire knows about burning. They'd seen the fossils, studied the extinction events, built simulations of what their world's apex hunters must have been like. But those creatures were all safely extinct. Their ecological niches eliminated by climate change, asteroid impacts, or in one memorable case, by being too successful at hunting and eating their own food supply into oblivion. The galaxy had been safe for prey species for approximately 400 million years. They'd had time to evolve intelligence, develop technology, and convince themselves that their survival was due to superiority rather than dumb luck and the absence of anything that wanted to eat them. Humans, it turned out, had evolved under slightly different circumstances. Earth's particular brand of chaos had produced something the galaxy's evolutionary playbook didn't account for, a species that was both intelligent and predatory. Not predatory in the sense of being able to hunt. Lots of species could hunt, but predatory in the sense of being descended from creatures that hunted other hunters, that competed with other apex species for the right to stand at the top of the food chain. Humans hadn't evolved because all their predators died. They'd evolved despite their predators, and then they'd systematically eliminated every single creature on their planet that posed a threat.
The human diplomatic corps, in their infinite wisdom, had figured this out relatively quickly. The first contact scenarios had gone poorly when they'd sent military personnel, who'd apparently scared the collective waste products out of 3 separate species, just by standing at attention. The solution had been elegant. Send the gentlest humans available. Find the people who'd spent their careers in meditation, conflict resolution, and therapeutic breathing exercises. Send the humans who got emotional about poetry and cried at sad movies, and once organized a protest to save a particular tree that was blocking a transit development. It had worked beautifully. The galaxy had met humans and thought, oh, how adorable. They're soft-bodied and emotional and completely non-threatening. They'd compiled databases full of information about human fragility, human environmental requirements, human dietary restriction. They'd noted that humans had relatively poor natural weapons, no armor plating, and sensory capabilities that were frankly embarrassing compared to species with proper evolutionary background. What they'd failed to note was that all this information came from humans who were deliberately selected to be as non-threatening as possible. The galaxy had built its entire understanding of humanity based on the equivalent of meeting someone's therapy golden retriever, and concluding that all dogs were gentle, harmless creatures, who just wanted belly rubs. They'd never met the wolf,
the human delegate whose personnel file listed his hobbies as classical literature and competitive baking, whose psychological evaluation had flagged him as exceptionally conflict-averse, whose entire career had been built on finding peaceful solutions to intractable problems, made a sound. It started somewhere deep in his chest, in a place that predated language, that predated civilization, that predated the entire concept of diplomacy. It rose through his throat with the accumulated rage of 300,000 years of evolutionary programming. Every ancestor who'd stared down something with bigger teeth and refused to back down. Every primate who'd screamed defiance at leopards in the dark. Every human who'd looked at something that wanted to kill them and decided that actually, no, the killing would be going the other way today. The roar that emerged was not a sound that should have come from a soft species. It was the kind of noise that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the oldest parts of the brain, the parts that existed solely to answer one question: am I prey right now? It carried frequencies that mammalian vocal cords had been optimized over millions of years to produce, designed specifically to trigger panic in anything with a nervous system. It resonated in the chest cavity, amplified by lung capacity designed for endurance hunting, projected with the force of a species that had survived by making itself heard over the screaming of their kills. The effect was immediate and comprehensive. The Vrelliks negotiator's exoskeleton locked up in a fear response so profound that his ancestors would have recognized it instantly. His limbs retracted against his body in the universal insect panic position, and his mandibles froze mid-claw. The color drained from his carapace, which shouldn't have been biologically possible, but apparently Terra found a way. His translator started emitting error codes because it couldn't find a linguistic equivalent for the noise it had just processed. The closest it could manage was threat vocalization magnitude error does not compute. The 3 Holveks representatives went through colors so quickly they nearly gave themselves chromatic whiplash. Orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, white, the last one being the shade their species turned when experiencing existential dread. Their vocal harmonics shattered into discordant screeching that their translators wisely declined to interpret. 2 of them scrambled backward so fast they collided with the conference table. The third simply dropped to the floor and went completely transparent, their species' emergency camouflage response triggering even though there was literally nowhere to hide in the room. The Nytheans' reaction was the most fascinating because crystalline species weren't supposed to have fear responses. They'd eliminated such crude emotional reactions millennia ago through philosophical refinement and technological enhancement. Their neural matrices were quantum-based, immune to the hormonal chaos that plagued soft bodies. Except the Nythean was vibrating at a frequency that indicated absolute terror. Her facets had shifted from rose quartz to a muddy brown that her species associated with contamination and death. She'd backed against the far wall so hard that her crystalline structure had actually cracked in 3 places, and she was emitting a harmonic that the translators rendered as continuous screaming, but was probably more accurately described as the quantum equivalent of "make it stop, make it stop." The chamber's environmental systems went haywire trying to process the sudden spike in stress pheromones, fear hormones, and what the sensors could only classify as collective biological panic. The lighting flickered as power diverted to the medical alert systems, which had correctly identified that every non-human in the room was experiencing symptoms consistent with acute trauma. The human stopped roaring. The silence that followed was somehow worse. He stood there breathing hard, his chest heaving with exertion, his face flushed with blood flow that his prey species audience couldn't help but notice. His eyes, which humans used for binocular predator vision, were locked onto the Vrellik negotiator with the kind of focus that prey animals spent their entire lives trying to avoid. When he spoke, his voice was perfectly level, perfectly calm, as if he hadn't just shattered the fundamental assumptions of 3 separate civilizations. I said, "Step back." The Vrellik negotiator stepped back. Then he stepped back again. Then he kept stepping back until he was pressed against the wall as far from the human as the chamber's geometry would allow. His clicking had stopped entirely. His limbs were trembling in a way that suggested his motor control had been reduced to suggestions rather than command. The Nythean was frantically accessing the Galactic database, her quantum consciousness burning through processing power, trying to find any reference, any classification, any recorded instance of a vocalization like the one she'd just experienced. The results were coming back negative, not negative as in no close matches, negative as in no match within 12 standard deviations of any recorded predator call in galactic history. Because there weren't any. Every species in the galactic community had evolved past the point where their predators existed. They had recordings of their extinct hunters, of course, museum pieces, academic curiosities, audio files that xenobiologists studied while safely behind force fields. But those were ancient history, evolutionary footnote. Nothing in the current galactic ecosystem made sounds like that, because nothing in the current galactic ecosystem was an active apex predator. Except, apparently, humans. One of the Holveks representatives had recovered enough motor control to access their own database. What they found made them cycle through another rainbow of terror. Humans, the files said, had evolved alongside creatures called lions, tigers, bears, wolves. The files included audio recordings. They'd never bothered listening to them before because who cared about extinct Earth fauna? They listened now. The sounds were similar, not identical, but similar enough to make the connection that their pattern recognition software absolutely screamed at them to acknowledge. The human hadn't just made a threat vocalization. He'd made the threat vocalization, the kind that every prey species in evolutionary history had learned to associate with imminent death. And he'd done it casually, like it was a natural stress response, like his body just defaulted to producing sounds that triggered existential panic in anything with survival instincts. The diplomatic conference, which had been going so well from the non-human perspective just 2 minutes ago, had completely inverted. The human was still standing in the same spot, his posture relaxed again, his breathing returning to normal. But the power dynamic had shifted so fundamentally that the room's atmospheric processors couldn't compensate fast enough for the change in pressure. The human delegate cleared his throat, which caused all 3 species to flinch violently. He adjusted his suit jacket with movements so deliberate they might as well have been written in neon letters, spelling out, "I am being very careful not to make sudden movements because I don't want you to have a collective cardiac event." "Perhaps," he said, his voice back to that diplomatic tone that now carried entirely different implications, "we should revisit the discussion about the mining colony. From a legal perspective, as I was attempting to explain before we got sidetracked." The Vrellik negotiator's translator was still producing error messages, but his survival instincts were working fine. His clicking when it resumed was so quiet and deferential that his own delegation would later claim they didn't recognize him. The Vrellik ascendancy would like to formally apologize for any misunderstanding regarding the territorial claim. "Upon reflection, we find your documentation to be comprehensive and legally sound." "How remarkably efficient," the human said, and there might have been the tiniest hint of amusement in his voice. "I appreciate your willingness to engage with the actual treaty language." The Nythean had stopped screaming, which was progress. Her harmonic emissions were still shaky, but she managed to produce something the translators rendered as the Nythean's sovereignty wishes to withdraw any objections to the human claim on colony designation. Epsilon Rack 40. "Wonderful," the human said. "I'm glad we could reach a consensus." The Holveks collective's 3 representatives were still cycling through colors, but they'd managed to coordinate enough to produce their signature 3-part harmony. It came out as the collective concurs with the withdrawal of objections. "We also wish to note for the record that we never had serious objections. Our participation was purely procedural. We have always respected human territorial claims. We love humans.
Humans are great. Please don't make that sound again. The human's expression flickered with what might have been concern. I apologize if I caused distress. That was not my intention. The fact that he could make a sound capable of triggering species-wide panic responses, and then apologize for it with genuine remorse somehow made it worse. The aliens in the room were recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the soft species from the water world. The conference concluded in record time. Documents were signed with trembling limbs and quantum signatures that looked suspiciously like they'd been executed while experiencing system errors. The human maintained his professional demeanor throughout, thanking everyone for their cooperation, expressing hope for future productive collaborations, and generally acting like he hadn't just revealed that his entire species was walking around the galaxy, disguised as harmless diplomats, while being biologically equipped to terrify everything with a nervous system. The real chaos started 6 hours later when the security footage leaked. By leaked, the official reports meant that all 3 delegations had immediately transmitted the recording to their respective governments, with priority flags that roughly translated to "everything we know is wrong, please advise." The Vrelliks military command watched the footage 17 times, then began a comprehensive review of every human interaction in their records. They found diplomatic meetings where humans had smiled politely while being threatened, trade negotiations where humans had accepted unfavorable terms rather than escalate tensions, border disputes where human ships had retreated rather than engaged. Every single instance they'd interpreted as weakness suddenly looked like restraint, and restraint from a predator species was exponentially more terrifying than weakness from a prey species. The Nytheans Sovereignty's Xenobiology Department had a collective breakdown that required 3 days of philosophical counseling. They'd built their entire understanding of consciousness on the assumption that intelligence evolved as a survival mechanism for physically inferior species. The idea that intelligence could evolve in something that was already dangerous shattered several fundamental theories and at least 2 religious doctrines. Their lead researcher published a paper titled "Predatory Intelligence, a Paradox in Flesh," that became required reading in academic institutions across 40 systems and caused 6 separate philosophical movements to schism. The Holveks collective did what they did best, gossiped about it at frequencies that carried across their entire communications network. Within 18 hours, every member of their species knew that humans were apparently apex predators, who'd been politely pretending otherwise for the sake of galactic harmony. The cultural impact was immediate. Human diplomats who'd previously been ignored in collective spaces suddenly found themselves surrounded by intensely respectful crowds who maintained very careful distances. One human attaché reported that a Holveks had actually bowed to her, which was not a gesture their species typically performed for anyone outside their own hierarchy. The Galactic Concordance Council held an emergency session that lasted 6 hours and accomplished nothing except establishing that nobody had any idea what to do with this information. The Human Diplomatic Corps, when contacted, responded with a statement so carefully worded it required 3 separate committees to decode. The essential message was, yes, humans can be dangerous. No, we're not going to be dangerous unless you make us. Please stop panicking. We liked it better when you just thought we were soft. This did not stop the panicking. If anything, it made it worse because the phrasing, "unless you make us," implied that there was a threshold of behavior that could trigger a predator response, and nobody knew where that threshold was. The resulting diplomatic paralysis was legendary. Species that had spent decades building cases for territorial disputes suddenly discovered that actually they were fine with current boundaries. Trade negotiations that had been deadlocked for years resolved themselves when one party realized they were negotiating with humans and maybe accepting slightly less favorable terms was worth not finding out what humans did when they got genuinely angry. The human delegate who'd started this whole cascade returned to Earth and filed a report that was notable for its brevity. Negotiations concluded successfully. All parties agreed to human territorial claim. Minor incident during proceeding. Would recommend stress management training for future assignments. His supervisor read the report, watched the security footage that had now spread across half the galaxy, and just stared at the screen for a solid minute. When she finally spoke, it was to mutter, "minor incident." He calls that a minor incident, but she approved his request for stress management training, because apparently the gentle humans they'd been sending to diplomatic conferences could still access the Predator toolkit when sufficiently provoked, and maybe everyone should know how to handle that before the galaxy decided to test humanity's patience in more creative ways. Within 3 months, Humans received invitations to join 17 different security councils, 42 military advisory boards, and one particularly interesting position on the Galactic Threat Assessment Committee. The invitations all had slightly different wording, but they boiled down to the same essential message: we've been making decisions about dangerous things without input from anything actually dangerous. Would you like to weigh in on what constitutes a real threat versus what just scares prey species? The irony was not lost on the human diplomatic corps. They'd spent years trying to convince the galaxy to take them seriously as equals, facing condescension about their soft bodies and limited sensory capabilities and embarrassing lack of natural armor. Then one delegate had a completely understandable stress reaction to being physically threatened, and suddenly the entire galaxy was recategorizing humans from harmless to please don't hurt us, we'll be good. The most amusing part from the human perspective was that they'd been trying to explain this the whole time. Their literature was full of stories about humanity's capacity for violence. Their history was a comprehensive record of creative destruction. Their cultural exports included detailed documentation of how they'd systematically eliminated every large predator on their planet, then felt bad about it and built conservation programs. The information had always been there. The galaxy just hadn't believed that the species, sending them poets and bakers and conflict resolution specialists, could also produce the sound that had triggered evacuation protocols in 3 separate embassy buildings. They believed it, and somewhere in the diplomatic archives there was a note appended to humanity's file. It was written in the dry bureaucratic language that the concordance used for everything, but translated roughly to recommended approach for human interactions. Don't assume softness means harmless. Don't push physical boundaries. Don't threaten them in confined spaces. Actually, just don't threaten them at all. They've been very polite about the whole apex predator thing, and we should probably keep it that way. Below that, someone had added an unofficial annotation that the translators rendered simply as soft species, hard limits. It was, all things considered, a fair assessment.